It's time to close those notebooks. It's time to put phones aside for a second. And speaking about changing gears and state of mind, just open up and listen. As a founder, I have 3 companies. There is one company out there that changed my mind and proved to be a great partner, and this is Sequoia. When we approached Sequoia, it was with a certain level of fear that we've done it. But what we found is a humble, passionate, disruptive, highly innovative kind of a company. And if I had to sum up what I am trying to build as a company into one person, it would be Mike Moritz. I welcome Mike into the stage, and let's see.
You're nice to say that. Thank you. So we've got a small group here. I suggest we just take 45 seconds, get on your feet because you've been sitting on these chairs, open the doors, get some fresh air in here, and open the doors here and we can get some fresh air and move around, and I think everybody will feel a little bit better, and then you won't all fall asleep in the next 30 minutes. While we're stretching and everything, thank you, Yoav. You're very nice to say those things about Sequoia. And I should also point out before we get going here that I know that Kenshu is a very high technology company because they just gave me one of these clickers, and I did a talk earlier today at a big conference in the city, and they gave me one of these clickers. And they said, actually, this doesn't operate wirelessly. I said, what do you mean? There's a big technology conference. He says, when you press the button, a little light in the back appears, and there's a guy who moves the slides on for you. That's the secret about TechCrunch Disrupt. So make yourselves comfortable, and that's actually true. So what I'm going to talk about today is the synthesis of, I hope it's somewhat interesting, or at least isn't too boring for you, but it's the synthesis of work that we've done at Sequoia for the last decade and a half, really, and we've tried to make sense of it all more recently and pull some themes together. And I wouldn't for a moment pretend to you that we knew all of this 10 or 15 years ago. We didn't. We were, as usual, sort of like the sight impaired trying to pin the tail on the donkey running around. But as we thought more about the areas that we've invested in, and also the good fortune about being right here in Silicon Valley, trying to make sense of this astonishing world that all of us are part of. The more that we've thought about it, the more that we think this small strip of land between where we are here and San Jose represents one of the most remarkable scenes of industrial change witnessed in human history. And what I'd like to talk about is what we, for lack of a better phrase, have started to refer to as the personal revolution. And it's a revolution that really is very all-encompassing and touches everything, in particular, about the way that we work. And we think that we're still in the very early stages of this, but that as, and I'll talk about it some more, the power of tools developed by technology companies, particularly in Silicon Valley, but also elsewhere around the world, develop and get rolled out. It's going to change the way that people live and work and are paid and compensate themselves in a manner that we haven't really contemplated before. But before I get into that, I want to give you a little backdrop, because the context is probably worth dwelling on for a couple of minutes. So this is a caricature of what life was like around 1750. A farmer with his tool, a plow, which in fact was a tool that hadn't changed very much in 1500 years or so. And the caricature is of a person who works by himself, supports his immediate family, tries to put enough food on the table. But he doesn't think really very much about selling or distributing his product, and let alone the notion of being connected to consumers anywhere. And this picture really hadn't changed, as I said, it hadn't changed in about 2,000 years. The standard of life, the standard of income for people was very similar in 1750 to what it had been a couple of millennium before, except of course in Tel Aviv, where they were driving around in Audis at that time. And then the first major change in the work environment took place, and it took place in an area about as small as Silicon Valley. It was in the northwestern part of England, and it centered around the growth of the textile industry and the textile mill. And I'd ask you just to pay attention to one thing here, which are the looms inside of the textile factory. And this represented the very first time that tools had ever been put in one place. So the tool had gone from being behind the horse or the oxen to a different method of making stuff, which was the tool in the factory. And this meant a profound change for everybody. Because for the first time, workers were sought to operate tools in a central workplace. And as you know, there was a profound shift from the agrarian economy to industrialization. And it had a massive effect on the way in which people lived. It was extremely disruptive. It upset lots of lives. It toppled many small enterprises. The single hand weaver went out of business because the textile mill was able to do things more efficiently and take advantage of the new canals and the new railroads that had grown up on the back of the evolution of the steam engine. But for some people, the so-called chimney aristocrats in Britain, this meant extraordinary wealth. But the change at that time was demonic, and it widened the gulf in society between rich and poor, and for many, many people brought an abrupt end to anything like an organized living. So that was the first major shift. And obviously I'm leading up to the idea that there's another major shift going on today. That was the first major shift that occurred in the organization of the workplace and the way that human commercial activity is conducted. The second one occurred 50 or 60 years later, sort of the second phase of the Industrial Revolution, but it played many of the same themes. It occurred not in Lancashire in northern England, but largely in the Midwest here, around Detroit, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. So think Detroit, Akron, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh. And here the real change was the introduction of marrying tools with the assembly line. But if you look at the overall organization of things, hadn't really changed very much from the era of the textile factory in northern England. Here, people instead, they went to work for the early automobile companies, and they all congregated to these factories. The factories obviously being grander, more elaborate, more integrated than the textile manufacturers. And in time, enormous numbers of white-collar workers went to work in and around these factories as well, because they created service functions like finance and sales and marketing. But like the textile mill, the auto factory was far removed from the consumers of the automobiles. There were multiple and arcane and lengthy distribution channels between the two. So bear those two things in mind, and I want to take a slight detour and talk to you about some of the enormous changes that have occurred in the last 2 decades, which, until we sit back and begin to think about the numbers, we take for granted. But I want to give you a perspective of the change, because there's never been a greater technology change in economic terms than's occurred in the last 20 years. So here's a snapshot of the bandwidth that is available around the world today. And you can see how much it's expanded in the last 20 years or so. It's hard to believe that 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we were still in the era of the acoustic coupler and 300 baud modems. The same thing goes for storage. In 1986, 14% of the entire storage in the world, of all the stuff that was stored in the world, this is incredible to believe, but it's true, was stored on vinyl long-playing records. That was only 25 years ago. The same with computation. 25 years ago, most of the computing resources in the world weren't in computers. They were in handheld calculators. And obviously, over time, those have been fueled, you know, the increase in computing power has been fueled by the evolution of the personal computer industry, and then the World Wide Web, and actually in the last 10 years by the enormous amount of computing power that's got sucked up in video game consoles. And here's another thing to ponder, which is the vast explosion in applications. The IBM 360, which was the most popular computer of the 1960s, at its peak had less than 250 applications. And these were boring applications. These were finance applications and enterprise resource planning applications. They weren't the sorts of applications that we think of today when we think of the ones that are available to run on Android devices and on iOS devices. And this has had a profound effect too on the way in which we think anyway the workplace is going to be organized. And here, catch this. To me, this is the most extraordinary change of all. And it's an attempt to characterize the amount of computing power that is in a Samsung Galaxy or a top-of-the-line iPhone compared to what you would have had to pay for similar computing capacity 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and 40 years ago. And the computing power that is in the tool that is in your pocket, or is vibrating, or is doing something or other, is probably running out of battery life, that's in your pocket today, that computing power would have cost you $33 million 40 years ago. And the $33 million 40 years ago would not have brought you audio, it wouldn't have brought you video, it wouldn't have brought you an accelerometer, it would not have brought you GPS. This was before GPS. So think about it. We're all walking around with a $33 million tool in our pocket or our handbag. And if you think that's, as I happen to do, a rather extraordinary development, consider this too. On the right-hand side are the number of smartphones. It's going to be around 700 million smartphones that get shipped all around the world. $33 million times 700 million that get shipped all around the world to people everywhere this year. Compare that to the other powerful tools here, even though we might think of them as mundane. fridges, which obviously have changed the way that people store food and everything, the peak year of production in America, or peak year of consumption for fridges in America, was in 2007, and it was 11 million units. Or washing machines that have that changed lives for millions of households all over the world. The peak year of consumption in America was in 2006, and it was 17 million. Or perhaps the most powerful tool of the last 75 years, the automobile, the peak production year in America was 1994, and it was just over 15 million. So this year, it puts it, with the shipments of 700 million smartphones, you can see, I hope from this slide, the extraordinary powerful tool that is being shipped everywhere. And finally, before I show you how all of this comes together, there's one other important trend. And we hear the tagline from time to time, but we don't sit down and look and visualize the consequences of all of this until we're forced to put it down on paper or put it on a slide. So here what we've tried to do is to show you what you can get basically for free particularly if you're an individual setting up a business or a small business that's up and running. Thinking about all the sorts of humdrum necessities that you'd like just to have as the operational backbone of your business or company. Nothing fancy, just the stuff on the right. Imagine what you would have had to pay for the same functionality a decade ago. Today, it's either free or you rent it by the sip. And those are for the mundane, underlying operational backbone of the company. The same goes for the functional aspects of a company. If you think through what was required to run an efficient recruiting organization, sales organization, or to engage in wide-scale promotion or marketing or fulfillment or customer service, and I didn't even put analytics, think Google Analytics, on this slide a decade ago, you would have been paying a king's ransom. And if you're a small business person or an individual proprietor, it would have been beyond your ken. And the reason that I dwell on the small business person or the individual proprietor is that in America, those are the largest form of businesses today, and the number is rising. There are 20 million self-employed, self-declared, self-employed professionals today. And around 30% of the American workforce works in small businesses. And that percentage is forecast to rise to over 60% over the next decade. And it's a result, in large part, of the forces of technology that I've just talked about in the last few slides. Because prior to the last decade, much of this was just completely out of the grasp of the small business person. And you can see this today in the way in which we think about our relatives, our children in particular, if they're of college age, or other people that we know, not just in Silicon Valley, but elsewhere, who do not work for large companies anymore. There is this yearning, in part driven by necessity and high unemployment rates in America, to start something, to be in something small, to harness these powers, to use creativity and inventiveness to do something that doesn't mean going to work for a large company. And I think we also see that represented in the way in which people move far more frequently between jobs during the course of their working lifetime. So where does this all come together? And think back again to the picture of the textile factory and the picture of the automobile factory. And I'd like to talk about what we at least think of as the data factory. And this term I think, can be referred to many companies in the internet and mobile business, and it has a seismic, or is having a seismic effect on the organization of work, on the way in which people sell and distribute products, and on the way in which consumers and businesses purchase those products. So this is a simple caricature, or I beg your pardon, there are a couple of slides here. I just wanted to give you a sense of the companies that we think of as being data factories, by which I mean they are able to gather information from both sides, from the people whose demand they're trying to satisfy and suppliers whose interest they're trying to satisfy, and then improve the service for both sides of the constituency. And you can, I know that there are companies missing on these slides, and we can come up with other characterizations, but I just wanted to give you a little flavor of this. So these are companies that, for sake of a better phrase, operate as labor data factories, matching workers with potential employees with potential employers. These are money data factories, where starting with enterprising ones like, and imaginative ones like Kickstarter and Indiegogo, they are able, thanks to the net, thanks to mobile, thanks to these $33 million computers in our pockets, to match people interested in raising money with the suppliers of capital. So labor and capital, two obviously of the keystones of any economic equation. But sitting at the middle of this, the most important category of these companies are the global data factories. And what they have done in, maybe, I think on this slide, this, since 1994, which was the year that Amazon got created, nothing like this has ever been seen before. And here is our representation of how it's changed everything. So this is the data factory taking place of the auto plant, or the loom, the place of the loom. And you'll notice on this picture that it has very few employees. Next thing to notice is this data factory clearly has tools and very powerful systems at its heart, but it also supplies tools for the first time to a huge number of companies and, more interestingly, individuals. And these individuals then contribute stuff, and I'll give you a couple of examples of this in a moment, or one in particular, back into the data factory that then distributes that stuff out to consumers. And the consumers, without the intermediaries of warehouses and car dealerships or retailers, contribute directly back to the data factory, which then goes in this sort of cycle of constantly getting smarter, constantly improving its service levels. And if you'd think of the bottom of this picture here as largely being free services, where the, quote, workers on the left-hand side are contributing stuff for free. Think of YouTube uploads, or and things that I'll talk about in a moment, or Yelp reviews, or things like that. And then at the top of this slide, I just want to show that these data factories are also supplying tools where people are making a ton of money out of employing these tools. And I've got a whole string of examples that I'll just riffle through in a couple of minutes that give you a sense of the power these tools provide for individuals and small businesses. And then the data factory is sitting in the middle of all of these, which explains why for companies like Google and Amazon and LinkedIn and Priceline and eBay, their business models are so extraordinary and sensational, because they sit right in the middle as massive consolidators and distributors of product that they then take directly to consumers. So here's an example of, and I'll show you the power of this, of one set of unpaid contributors. LinkedIn has a program, I don't know if any of you see it, called LinkedIn Influencers. It's not even a year old. And they invited a bunch of people, business leaders around the world, to contribute posts to LinkedIn. And they were able, they have about 300 people, I think, contributing content for which they pay nothing, which they then distribute out to their global audience. The result has been that thanks to this, thanks to the harnessing of all this unpaid contribution, LinkedIn is now among the most popular online business sites in the world. The traffic to LinkedIn today, which is its flagship content property, has gone up by 8-fold in 9 months. People like Bill Gates easily have in excess of 1 million people following the posts that he places for nothing, for free, on LinkedIn. Now, I want to talk about, so that's, and there I could have added Yelp and YouTube and Amazon reviews and other things like that, all of which go to make those particular services better. But now I'd like to switch a little bit and talk about how individuals, particularly in a country like America with very high unemployment, thanks to these data factories, have now got a new form of subsistence and income. And think of them in 2 broad categories. There's the category of service workers, people who perhaps don't have as many skills as all of us who've had all of our fancy educations are fortunate and lucky enough to have, but otherwise perhaps might either have been unemployed or been service workers working at Walmart or as some retailer or flipping burgers at KFC. So they may be drivers like this gentleman at Uber, where the data factory that's Uber is able to match him with potential clients much more efficiently and effectively than he ever could possibly have done that by himself. Instacart is a company that Sequoia made a recent investment in that provides online grocery shopping services for people right now in the Bay Area, but soon to be elsewhere. And here, most of the contractors are college students. And this lady here, Laura Barnum, and she makes $600 a week from working as a Instacart contract shopper that she wouldn't have been able to do before Instacart came along. And Instacart assigns her jobs and helps consumers on the other side find and not leave their home to get groceries 3 or 4 hours after they press the button to place the order. And TaskRabbit, I suspect everybody knows of. It's a very similar theme where people now use TaskRabbit, like this lady illustrated here, for 100% of their income. This is a dramatic change. It's the first time really that you've had the organized factory providing these sorts of working possibilities and particular financial possibilities for individuals. I'm going to riffle through, perhaps a bit quickly, perhaps a bit laboriously, some other examples, but I want to do so to show how pervasive and extensive this trend of the data factory is and of pushing tools out all over the world. So eBay, I think it's well known, has 25 million sellers. But north of 1 million people all around the world use eBay now as a primary or secondary source of income, including the fella pictured here, who runs a multiple $million-dollar TV refurbishment business in Texas, which is sold entirely through eBay. Google AdWords. You've all heard a lot about it. I'm not going to belabor the point. because of Ken Chu's connection with Google and other companies in that arena. But this little company is a flower producer up in the northeast of America, and restarted its business effectively as the result of its ability to target customers via Google AdWords. YouTube. There's free contribution, but there are also people like Michelle Phan who make a ton of money from what they do on YouTube. Michelle, I don't know if people know of her, was this lady in Los Angeles who just went on YouTube to record videos of how she applied makeup to herself. And she's generating a very large following, now has her own business built on this, and has become a spokesperson for Lancôme. We all know about Amazon, which I think is the most remarkable data factory of all of these big companies that I've alluded to. And this is an example from its best known business, its marketplace business. This gentleman, Bryce Hoskin, had a little sled maker that was flat on its backside, and he thought he was going to have to close it down before he came across Amazon, which has allowed him to build a thriving business. He now ships sleds from the middle of America all over the world, entirely thanks to the tools that are provided by the data factory called Amazon. Amazon is upset, again, through the power of distributed tools, the world of publishing, not just because of what it's done to the conventional bookstore, but more particularly through the Kindle Direct Publishing platform, where it's given authors tools by which allows them to circumvent the arcane Byzantine channels that they used to have to go through with agents and publishers and distributors and bookstores. It means that an author keeps 70% of what they can sell, compared to 10 or 12 or 15% in the old regime. It means the author gets paid extremely quickly, as opposed to 6 months or a year-long delay in the old book publishing regime. And it means that the author can also be their individual own marketing department and entrepreneur. And so there have been a whole bunch of people now who have had million-seller titles on the Kindle Direct Publishing platform without intervention from any outside agent or publisher or distributor or bookseller. You know about Pinterest. A similar example, but this catapulted, unlike all the other examples, but I wanted to make sure we all knew about this too, catapulted this tiny 12-person company. This is Amazon Web Services. It allowed them to go global, Pinterest to go global, within 9 months with fewer than 12 people, because they perched all of their infrastructure atop the tools that AWS provided. This is a little example of Weebly, which is a publishing platform that we're business partners of. And here's a lady who, Carrie, they don't allow us to use the last name, who had to close her retail gift shop, built a website using Weebly, and now is able to support herself thanks entirely to the tools that Weebly and companies like Facebook and Twitter and some of the other ones that I mentioned, Dropbox, have provided her. Here's Airbnb. Last night, 150,000 rooms were booked by people staying on Airbnb. Many people on Airbnb, many of the hosts of Airbnb, use the income they get from Airbnb to pay their mortgages. There are a lot of defaults in America that would have occurred, home mortgage defaults, without supplemental income from Airbnb. And again, Airbnb is the data factory providing these booking tools to consumers, and then also booking services and property management systems and payment mechanisms to people looking to make extra money from unused room or part of an apartment. Another example from a completely different genre, which is real estate brokerage. Hedda is a lady I talked to last week. She's a San Diego realtor who had a small business that was struggling before she discovered Trulia, the online real estate company in San Francisco. So in the course of 5 years, thanks, she will say, entirely to the tools and services of Trulia, her income went from about $100,000 to $600,000, and it's been so successful that she's been able to buy the real estate firm that she used to work for. Jody Rosen is a designer. She lives in Toronto. She uses a service called House. She started her own line of furniture because House connected her to a zillion, well, to a whole ecosystem of home improvement professionals, but to an audience of 15 million people, 15 million uniques every month. And she now does business outside of Canada and outside of North America. Again, thanks to the tools provided in this case by House. Square. We've all seen the little dongles. Here's an example of something that would never have been possible before 5 or 6 years ago. There's a Costa Rican entity called Pura Vida that a couple of characters from here started, where bracelets are made in Costa Rica and then distributed by about 500 students on college campuses around America. Each of those students is armed with a Square dongle and either an iPad or a mobile phone, which is their mobile cash register, and then the remittances all go back to Costa Rica, where it's distributed among the manufacturers of the bracelets. Imagine that in the world before this particular data factory, Square, existed. Unity, and I've just got 2 more examples and then I'll wrap up. Unity is sits in a very similar position. This is a company that makes, has a development platform, at first a 3D development platform for producers and designers of video games. And it now has a distribution platform for those companies. And if you're a little game developer, and actually now a substantial game developer, your life has changed completely. Your business prospects, your revenue prospects, your distribution prospects have changed entirely because of what Unity has been able to do for you. And finally, Etsy, the crafts marketplace. This lady up in the Northwest, she quit her job because she's been able to build a business on the back of Etsy selling landmark mugs. Now, you might well say, with that long litany of examples, what does that mean? Now, for all of us, this personal revolution is nothing but good news. Again, we're incredibly fortunate, but most people in America are not. Change has been as demonic today in the personal revolution as it was in some of these in the 2 big shifts in the Industrial Revolution. We all know about industries that have got completely sideswiped as a result of the personal revolution, whether it's the newspaper business or the mainline retailer or other sorts of things. And the consequences are really terrible for lots and lots of people. So I showed you the image earlier of how few people work in these data factories. And take a look at this chart. You have 2.2 million service workers who work in Walmart. I don't want to be rude, I don't want to offend anyone, but I'd be surprised if any of them, or very few of them, tiny percentage, would be qualified to work at Google. Or take Apple, which employs 80,000 people, and that includes about 35,000 people in their retail stores. So the core Apple is under 50,000 people. Apple last year, with this tiny workforce, generated more profit than every restaurant chain, every hospitality chain, and every retailer in the Fortune 500. And they did so with 50,000 people. So for those of us whose life is in this area, it's great. For everybody else, it's very, very tough. And you can see that in this slide. Household income in America has barely shifted in 40 years. The standard of living, the standard of life for most Americans just went like that until about 1975, until about the onset of the microprocessor. And since then, because manufacturing jobs have shifted overseas, and there's really been nothing other than the service economy to take up that slack, and because of the mismatch of skills, where most Americans are not qualified to be beneficiaries other than as consumers of the personal revolution, life is extremely tough. It's even tougher if you're poor. This was the median wage in America in 1968. This is what the minimum wage is today. And think of it. Think of all the cranes in downtown San Francisco. And imagine, and we all know, people who live on $200,000, $250,000 income in San Francisco who are forced to move out because they can't afford to keep a house there or educate their children there, directly because they've been sideswiped by the effect of all the fortunate recipients of Google and Facebook and Twitter and Dropbox stock who are buying million-dollar condos in downtown San Francisco. And similarly, look at the GDP growth. You would have thought that for all the talk that I've just, all the words that I've just sprayed in your direction, GDP growth in America would be a lot better. It isn't. It's great in our part of the economy. In the rest of the economy, because of the global shifts overseas, it's pretty darned dreadful. It isn't helped by the fact that we have an active policy of rudely restricting the number of extremely talented people who can come into America, create technology businesses, and then employ others. And you know, the cruel irony is that we deport some of the most talented, including fellas like Robin Lee, who's the founder of Baidu, who was an early employee of an early internet company in the Valley called InfoSeek, and then went home to China to found Baidu. And the final point I would like to make is this. Here's another big reason why the personal revolution is so different from any other major technology change that's preceded us. You'll remember that I talked about the textile mill being really located just in a small part of the north of England, or the automobile factory in these and steel mills and stuff, glass making, rubber, just around the industrial belt in America. These were very concentrated. It's hard to take an automobile factory and plop it down in Brazil or in China or in India. It's much easier to do that if you're a data factory. And while I've given you examples here today of the data factories that are American companies, we have to remember that there are data factories that are foreign companies, and they are doing on their own home turfs what the American data factories are doing in the US and to a large extent in Western Europe. So this is the first economic revolution that has occurred simultaneously in different places around the world. And the result of that is, tough though it is for us to believe, that more than half of the world's most valuable internet and mobile companies are not in America. They're outside America, many of them in Asia, China and Japan and Korea. And they've all been started and furnished because of the incredible democratization of the technology that started here between Cavallo Point and San Jose. So I hope that's where I will wind up and finish and let you be. But I hope at least it's given you some sense of the way in which we've thought about capturing all the investments that at Sequoia we've made over the last couple of decades, and why we think, as a result, not because of Sequoia, but because of what all of us in the technology business have done, the economic shifts and the profound social changes are not finished, they're just beginning. Thank you very much.